Streaming now, this is the Wood TV Live Desk.
And good afternoon, everyone. Phil Penarski here with the Wood TV Live Desk. And, of course, we are very excited to be joined with News 8's political reporter Rick Albin as he's set to help us break down the elections that are coming up tomorrow. Rick, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, it's my pleasure. There's lots to talk about.
Yeah, no, definitely. And, of course, we here at Wood TV are your local election headquarters, so we're definitely going to be taking a look at some of the key races. Specifically, Rick, the thing I want to start out most is with the State, House, and Senate. A lot of those key races are up for grabs. If you just wouldn't mind, go ahead and just start diving in and telling us a little bit about it.
Well, it's the race within the race, because redistricting has changed the paradigm for so many of those seats, and we know that some of them have been drawn in what look like more Democrat-leaning seats, with the number of Democratic voters historically in the new boundaries that could give an advantage in some of those. But I hasten to add that we haven't tested any of those contests yet. This will be the first time that folks have actually gone to the polls. So it's a hypothetical on how those districts look. But given the differences in the lines, and they are dramatically different in some cases, I think there is a possibility that we can see a shift in the legislature, if not an entire flip. Democrats haven't held the Senate in decades. They have held the House. They had that for a couple of terms back in late 2000 to about 2010. But Republicans, by and large, have dominated in the House and Senate since about 2000, and even before that. But if you just use that as kind of a high water mark for them. So over the last 22 years, they've had full control of the House and the Senate for all except 4 years in the House. So I think that it is something we'll be watching very closely. We've got a couple of Senate races here in West Michigan that I'll be watching. They both involve incumbent senators who are being challenged by term-limited House members. So those are interesting to me. And we have a number of House races that could also be in play. But it'll be the whole statewide package, and there are a number of other races in the Senate, particularly on the east side of the state, that could have a big impact. Remember, in the Senate, you get control with 20 members. It's 56 in the House. Right now, Republicans have 22 in the House, and Democrats have 16. So Republicans need to hold 20 of those seats that they now have, and it'll be interesting to watch that, or to see if Democrats can pick up 4 seats and actually take control of the Senate.
You know, definitely something to keep an eye on. Kind of switching gears a little bit, taking a look at some of the proposals that are going to be on Michiganders' ballots this time around. The latest Epic MRA polls show that all three have a lot of support and could potentially all three of them pass. But is there one in particular that you are kind of wary about seeing as it could potentially fail, or are those polls you think telling the full story?
Well, if you look at the Epic MRA poll, which is our poll, if you look at that one from last week, that has a comfortable margin for all three of those polls. But in most polling, Prop 3 is the one that has perhaps the lowest level of support, though still passing easily in our polling. And I have seen some other polls that put that a little closer. But one of the things you always have to look at in an election, and that is voter enthusiasm. And I think that Prop 3 that deals with reproductive rights and abortion rights has got a lot of emotion. And I think it engenders a strong reaction from a lot of folks. So I think you'll see a big number of votes in that race. But again, the polling would indicate that it enjoys enough support that it could pass. I would hasten to add that may not be the final word. That is a very broad, very encompassing proposal that could, and I am not an attorney, so I will not start wading off in that, but just logically speaking, could still face some legal challenges if it does pass. But right now, all three of the props seem to be in a comfortable position. But that's why you have elections, because polls don't tell the story. What happens at the polls will tell the story tomorrow. And it really is about a turnout race. If we start to see one side or the other surging in some of these other races, that can have an impact on those props too. So it really will come down to which party is able to turn out the vote, because I think particularly in the governor's race, that's been the focus for the last couple of weeks, with probably what is a single-digit race, certainly according to Real Clear Politics. it would be a low single digit, maybe 4-5 percentage points. If it's that close, then the candidate who turns out their votes better, their likely votes better, could have an advantage, and that could impact those proposals.
Mm-hmm. No, and once again, Phil Penarski here with the Wood TV Live Desk, joined by News 8's political reporter Rick Albin, discussing the midterms as they are set to kick off tomorrow. Rick, now we kind of want to switch on over to the school board. Those seats, a lot more names that you will probably see on those ballots for voters. What do you think is the main cause of seeing this extended amount? We have it in our web story over on woodtv.com, this extended line of people trying to get in. How would you kind of explain what's causing that?
Well, and that's a little bit out of my purview from the standpoint that I cover pretty much state and federal elections. But look, anybody who's been watching and listening knows that over the course of the past 2.5 years, that school boards have become a real flashpoint. And it started, I think, largely with the pandemic, when school boards were in many, if not all, but most cases, were under a directive from a health department or some health agency in regard to wearing masks. And as we all recall, there was a big controversy among some people about whether or not children should be wearing masks. There were questions about whether or not schools could be safely open. There were questions about should you have a dual path of learning for children who don't feel comfortable going to class, but keep schools open for those students whose parents want them to go to class. So some of those school board meetings, again, we remember the stories, became heated, and a lot of folks became pretty agitated. Fast forward to 2022, there's been a lot of conversation about any number of controversial subjects that may or may not being taught in school districts. And I think that, plus the reading curriculum and what books are available and what books should be available, I think that there are people who have said, we want to have a say in this, and one of the ways they think they can have a say is to run for the school board. Now, I would say that on the upside, all of this attention to school boards and all of these people running for school boards and all of those of us who vote who have had to take time and acquaint ourselves with those candidates, I think all that's positive. But at the same time, you have to make sure you do that. You have a responsibility to know who you're voting for. So even now, if you haven't voted, and if you really haven't thought about it, go take a look at your ballot, because you're right. You're going to see names on there, and a lot more names in most cases than you've seen probably ever. Because generally it'll be a matter of pick 2 or 3, and there are only 2 or 3 names on there. Well, this year you're really going to have to pick.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm kind of going from the ballot, the ballot that will have a lot of names that maybe you don't recognize. The governor's race, you will probably recognize 2 very prominent names there, with Governor Whitmire as well as the challenger Tudor Dixon. That is probably one of the bigger races that we'll be paying a close eye on tomorrow. If you wouldn't mind, what are we kind of hearing from both campaigns? We've seen in recent polls, ever since really the debate here on Wood TV, that Tudor Dixon has gained a little bit of ground on Governor Whitmire, and if you wouldn't mind, just kind of what are we hearing from the two sides as we get set? We're under 24 hours until the polls.
I talked to both camps earlier today, and they both are cautiously optimistic. If the polling is correct, and I referenced earlier the Real Clear Politics average, it had been averaging somewhere, that's a group of polls, and they put them all together, and it had been between 3.2 and 3.5% in favor of Whitmer last week. That Epic MRA poll that you mentioned had a much wider difference between the governor and challenger Dixon. So with that factored in, that average went up to about 4.5%, a little less than 4.5%. Still, there were other polls that were being factored in that were 5 and 4, and one was a tie. So I think that's a close race. I can't say how close. But I do think if some of those lower numbers come close to being true, that turnout is going to be the factor. And when I say that, people say, well, of course, turnout always makes a difference. But here's what I mean. There are some races that are so far divided that if you turned out all of your potential voters, all of the people who wanted to vote for you, you still couldn't win because the numbers just wouldn't be high enough because there is such a separation. Because this is so close, the candidate the campaigns that will more effectively turn out their voters could create the difference in a race if those numbers are close enough. And again, I qualify that because polling is interesting in 2022. The electorate has changed their mindset a good deal over the course of the pandemic, the 2020 election, the 2016 election, and the aftermath of that. So I don't know how much faith to put in those, but right now those are the tools we have. So I think it looks to be a relatively close race. And one of the things that I don't know is prior to that debate, you're right, up until that debate, it was an about 11-point spread. And that cut about in half in the ensuing 2 weeks from our debate. And I think that was an interesting moment in this campaign. But what I don't know is how many absentee ballots were mailed in before that debate when the separation may have been 11 points. And will that be reflected in the early ballots that came in, or does it not? Because we don't know who those ballots were coming from necessarily, where they were coming from. I mean, you can track by zip code, but not something we could do. I think it'll be interesting to see, and we'll also see how it turns out, because the turnout on election day could have a big impact on that, and it could sway those numbers too.
Yeah, no, Rick, definitely something to keep an eye on as well. And I really want to thank you so much for joining us today, really helping break down everything for everybody watching at home and for me included in that. So I really want to thank you there. And again, Wood TV 8 is your local election headquarters. We're going to be having all of the races. All of them are going to have an eye on them all throughout tomorrow, into Wednesday, into Thursday. We're expecting this to be a multi-day event, truly, and Rick is going to be at the forefront of that. So, Rick, we're going to let you get back to it. I, again, want to thank you so much for stopping by, and I want to thank, yeah, of course.